a storyteller. What do you know of Hallandren history?
Much, my queen.
Tell me of the days before the division between Idris and Hallandren.
The man reached into a pocket. He pulled out a handful of sand and began to rub it between his fingers, letting it drop in a soft stream toward the ground.
Her Majesty wishes one of the deep stories, from long before. A story before time began.
I wish to know the origins of the Hallandren god-kings.
Then we begin in the distant haze.
The storyteller brought up another hand, letting powdery black sand drop from it, mixing with the sand that fell from the first hand.
The first god-king of Hallandren is ancient. Ancient, yes. Older than kingdoms and cities, older than monarchs and religions. Not older than the mountains, for they were already here. Like the knuckles of the sleeping giants below, they formed this valley, where panthers and flowers both make their home. We speak of just the valley then, a place before it had a name. The people of Chadesh still dominated the world. They sailed the inner sea, coming from the east, and it was they who first discovered this strange land. Their writings are sparse, their empire long since been taken by the dust, but memory remains. Perhaps you can imagine their surprise upon arriving here. A place with beaches of fine, soft sand, with fruits aplenty, and with strange, alien forests. Paradise, they called it. A paradise hidden between the mountains. A land with pleasant rains that never grew cold. A land where succulent fruit grew spontaneously. A land of color, because of the tears of Edgley. The striking flowers of such brilliance that could yield dyes that would hold fast in any cloth. The first Returned was born during this time, aboard a ship that was sailing the coast. Returned can now be found in all parts of the world, but the first one, the man whom you call Vo, but we name only by his title, was born here, in the waters of this very bay. He declared the 5 visions. He died a week later. The men of his ship founded a kingdom upon these beaches, then called Hanald. Before their arrival, all that had existed in these jungles was the people of Pankal. Now, you may wonder why I must travel back so far. Should I not speak of the many war, of the shattering of kingdoms, of the 5 scholars, of Khalad the usurper and his phantom army, which some say still hides in these jungles, waiting? Those are the events we focus upon, the ones men know the best. To speak only of them, however, is to ignore the history of 300 years that led up to them. Would there have been a many war without knowledge of the Returned? It was a Returned, after all, who predicted the war and prompted Strife-Lover to attack the kingdoms across the mountains.
Strife-Lover?
Yes, Your Majesty. Strife-Lover. Another name for Khalad the usurper.
That sounds like the name of a Returned.
Indeed. Khalad was Returned, as was Peacegiver, the man who overthrew him and founded Hallandren. We haven't arrived at that part yet. We are still back in Hanald, the outpost become kingdom founded by the men of the First Returned's crew. They were the ones who chose the First Returned's wife as their queen, then used the tears of Edgley to create fantastic dyes which sold for untold riches across the world. This soon became a bustling center of trade. The tears of Edgley, the source of Hallandren wealth. Such small things, so easy to grow here. And yet, this is the only soil where they will live. In other parts of the world, dyes are very difficult to produce, expensive. Some scholars say that the many war was fought over these flower petals, that the kingdom of the Kuth and Huth were destroyed by little drips of color.
But only some of the scholars say that, storyteller. What do the rest say? Why was the many war fought in their opinions?
Most agree that the many war was not only about petals squeezed dry, but a much greater prize. People squeezed dry. You know, perhaps, that the royal family was growing increasingly interested in the process by which breath could be used to bring objects to life. Awakening, it was then first being called. It was a fresh and poorly understood art then. It still is, in many ways. The workings of the souls of men, their power to animate ordinary objects and the dead to life, is something discovered barely 4 centuries ago. A short time, by the accounting of gods. The years leading up to the many war, those were the days of the 5 scholars and the discovery of the new commands. To some, this was a time of great enlightenment and learning. Others call them the darkest days of men, for it was then we learned to best exploit one another. One of the 5 scholars made a discovery. Commands, methods, the means by which a lifeless could be created from a single breath. This, perhaps, seems a small thing to you, but you must look at the past of this kingdom and its founding. Hallandren began with the servants of a returned and was developed by an expansive mercantile effort. It controlled a uniquely lucrative region which, through the discovery and maintenance of the northern passes, combined with increasingly skillful navigation, was becoming a jewel coveted by the rest of the world. And so the war came. The 5 scholars split, joining different sides. Some kingdoms gained the use of lifeless, while others did not. Some kingdoms had weapons, others could only envy. To answer the gods' question, my story claims one other reason for the many war: the ability to create lifeless so cheaply. Before the discovery of the single breath command, lifeless took 50 breaths to make. Extra soldiers, even a lifeless one, are of limited use if you can gain only 1 for every 50 men you already have. However, being able to create a lifeless with a single breath, 1 for 1, that will double your troops, and half of them won't need to eat. Lifeless are no stronger than living men, they are the same. They are not more skilled than living men, they are the same. However, not having to eat like regular men, that advantage was enormous. Mix that with their ability to ignore pain and never feel fear, and suddenly you had an army that others could not stand against. It was taken even further by Khalad, who was said to have created a new and more powerful type of lifeless, gaining an advantage even more frightening.
What kind of new lifeless?
Nobody remembers, Your Majesty. The records of that time have been lost. Some say they were burned intentionally. Whatever the true nature of Khalad's phantoms, they were frightening and terrible. So much so that even though the details have been lost in time, the phantoms themselves live on in our lore and our curses.
Do they really still exist out there? Like the stories say? An unseen army waiting for Khalad to return and command them again?
Alas, I can tell only stories. As I said, so much from that time is lost to us now.
But we know of the royal family. They broke away because they didn't agree with what Khalad was doing, right? They saw moral problems with using lifeless.
Why, yes. Yes, they did, Your Majesty.
Siri raised an eyebrow.
Psst. He's lying to you.
Your Grace, I beg your pardon. There are diverging explanations. Why, I am a teller of stories. All stories.
And what do other stories say?
None of them agree, Your Majesty. Your people speak of religious indignation and of treachery by Khalad the usurper. The Pankal people tell of the royal family working hard to gain powerful lifeless and awakeners, then being surprised when their tools turned against them. In Hallandren, they tell of the royal family aligning themselves with Khalad, making him their general and ignoring the will of the people by seeking war with bloodlust. But time burns away behind us, leaving only ash and memory. That memory passes from mind to mind, then finally to my lips. When all is truth and all are lies, does it matter if some say the royal family sought to create lifeless? Your belief is your own.
Either way, the return took control of Hallandren.
Yes, and they gave it a new name, a variation on the old one. And yet, some still speak regretfully of the royals who left, bearing the blood of the first returned to their highlands.
Blood of the first returned?
Yes, of course. It was his wife, pregnant with his child, who became the first queen of this land. You are his descendant.
Siri sat back. Lightsong turned. Curious.
You didn't know this?
Siri shook her head.
If this fact is known to my people, we do not speak of it.
Lightsong seemed to find that interesting. Siri smiled, sensing a subtle way to get to the question she really wanted to ask.
That means that the God Kings of Hallandren carried on without the blood of the first returned.
Yes, Your Majesty.
And how many God Kings have there been?
5, Your Majesty, including His Immortal Majesty Lord Susablan, but not including Peacegiver.
5 kings in 300 years?
Yes, Your Majesty. The dynasty of Hallandren was founded at the conclusion of the Many War, the first one gaining his breath and life from Peacegiver himself, who was revered for dispelling Kalad's phantoms and bringing a peaceful end to the Many War. Since that day, each God King has fathered a stillborn son who then returned and took his place.
Wait, how did Peacegiver create a new God King?
Now there is a story lost in time. How indeed. Breath can be passed from one man to another, but breath, no matter how much, does not make one a god. Legends say that Peacegiver died by granting his breath to his successor. After all, can a god not give his life away to bless another?
Not exactly a sign of mental stability, in my opinion. You don't encourage confidence in our predecessors, storyteller. Besides, even if a god gives away his breath, it doesn't make the recipient divine.
I only tell stories, Your Grace. Peacegiver was no ordinary returned, for he managed to stop the lifeless from rampaging. Indeed, he sent away Kalad's phantoms, which formed the main bulk of the Hallandren army. By doing so, he left his own people powerless. He did so in an effort to bring peace. By then, of course, it was too late for Kuth and Huth. However, the other kingdoms, Pankal, Tedradel, Gis, and Hallandren itself, were brought out of the conflict. Can we not assume more from this god of gods who was able to accomplish so much? Perhaps he did do something unique, as the priests claim. Leave some seed within the god kings of Hallandren, allowing them to pass their power and divinity from father to son.
Heritage which would give them claim to rule. With such an amazing god as their progenitor, they could become God Kings. And the only one who could threaten them would be the royal family of Idris, who can apparently trace their line back to the first returned. Another heritage of divinity, a challenger for the rightful rule in Hallandren.
That didn't tell her how the God Kings had died, nor did it tell her why some gods, such as the first returned, could bear children while others could not.
They're immortal, correct?
Indeed, Your Majesty. Like all returned, the god kings do not age. Agelessness is a gift for all who reach the 5th heightening.
But why have there been 5 God Kings? Why did the first one die?
Why do any returned pass on, Your Majesty?
Because they are loony.
Because they tire. Gods are not like ordinary men. They come back for us, not for themselves. And when they can no longer endure life, they pass on. God Kings live only as long as it takes them to produce an heir.
That's commonly known?
Of course it is, Your Majesty. At least to storytellers and scholars. Each God King has passed from this world shortly after his son and heir was born. It is natural. Once the heir has arrived, the God King grows restless. Each one has sought out an opportunity to use up his breath to benefit the realm. And then they pass on, leaving their people blessed and their heir to rule.
Not exactly the most pleasant thing to inform a newlywed wife, storyteller, that her husband is going to grow bored with life as soon as she bears him a son.
I seek not to be charming, Your Grace. I only tell stories.